Hello everyone and welcome to the channel The Territory of Cinema. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the film The Equalizer 2 from 2018. The quiet life Robert McCall had carved out for himself in Brooklyn, a sanctuary built on the foundation of his past, begins to fracture with the news of a familiar loss. Susan Plummer, a dear friend and former colleague from his days working covertly for the CIA, is found dead. The official report cites a robbery gone wrong, but the unnerving precision of the scene whispers a different truth to McCall. He recognizes the hallmarks of a professional cleanup, a message sent through the violence aimed squarely at those who knew too much about the agency's darker operations. McCall, a man whose retirement was less about rest and more about channeling his extraordinary, almost lethal skill set into small acts of localized justice, helping the oppressed in his neighborhood, tutoring at a local community center, cannot let Susan's death be dismissed. His commitment to fairness, honed over years as a Black Ops operative whose official records were scrubbed clean, compels him to investigate. This isn't the random street violence he usually counters. This targets his history. His investigation pulls him back into the shadows he swore he'd left behind. The trail leads him toward a network of former operatives, men and women similarly disbanded or sidelined after key missions. He starts by examining Susan's last known contacts, eventually focusing on a specific, highly compartmentalized assignment they both worked on years prior in Istanbul, something involving international intrigue and perhaps significant misappropriation of resources or classified information. This quest for vengeance, or perhaps more accurately for truth and retribution, places him directly opposite his former employers and handlers. Dave York, another veteran from their shared past, emerges as a key figure. York, disillusioned and bitter, has channeled his exceptional tactical abilities into a mercenary operation, essentially privatizing the CIA's dirty work for the highest bidder. He has become the very thing they once fought against, an agent operating without conscience or oversight, now directly involved in Susan's murder to tie up loose ends concerning the old mission. The narrative becomes a slow, methodical tightening of the net. McCall uses his meticulous preparation, the careful surveillance, the acquisition of necessary tools often purchased from his network of aging, loyal contacts, like the reliable pharmacist in his neighborhood, to dismantle York's operation piece by piece. We see echoes of his past proficiency, the sudden, brutal efficiency in confined spaces, the strategic use of everyday objects as weapons, the almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. The climax finds McCall tracking the remaining members of York's crew to a small, remote coastal town that serves as their fortified base of operations. It's here, against the backdrop of a fierce storm, a fitting atmospheric mirror to the violence about to unfold, that McCall confronts his old comrade, York. The ensuing fight is intensely personal, a clash between two men who understand the language of lethal force better than any other. McCall is fighting not just for Susan, but for the very integrity of the moral code he tries to uphold in his quiet life. He systematically eliminates the threat, restoring a semblance of balance to the chaos York introduced. The final confrontation with York is a definitive, somber end to the old chapter, confirming that while the ghosts of the past can be put down, they never truly vanish. McCall then retreats once more to the anonymity of his present, the silent guardian having completed his necessary, albeit brutal, work. The weight of Susan's death felt heavier than any assignment McCall had ever undertaken. It was a personal violation, not just of his peace, but of the fragile trust he had placed in the idea that stepping away meant safety. He carried the sorrow of their shared history, a bond forged in the ethically gray expanse of espionage, where loyalty was currency and failure meant oblivion. Susan had always been the compass in the dark for him, the one who understood the inherent contradiction in being a killer trained to protect. His day-to-day life, filled with the quiet rhythm of driving elderly neighbors to appointments and working diligently at the community center, now felt like a thinly stretched veneer over a roaring engine of capability. When he walked those streets, the people he helped, the kids learning from him, the old folks relying on his steadfast presence, were his new purpose, the tangible evidence that his skills could be directed toward creation rather than destruction. But Susan's murder demanded the latter. As McCall delved deeper, the names he uncovered were not strangers, but echoes from his own training syllabus. The realization that York, a man known for his cold competence even in their agency days, had fallen so far as to become a hired gun, confirmed McCall's bleakest assessment of their former world. Once you learn the system will eventually turn you into the enemy. York represented the corrosion of idealism, the transformation of duty into pure, unadulterated profit motive. McCall's methods of investigation were an art form honed by necessity. He didn't use modern digital tracking as much as he relied on human intuition and old-school tradecraft. He visited familiar haunts, a bookshop in the Bronx where information exchanged hands over dusty first editions, a specific diner booth where local whispers converged. He moved through the city like a phantom, observing security patterns, noting shifts in traffic flow, skills that were now automatic, deeply ingrained reflexes that made him terrifyingly effective against men who relied on predictable, modern surveillance. When he finally located York's operation, hidden away from the glittering scrutiny of the city, the isolation only amplified the danger. McCall felt a deep, almost paternal disappointment in York, a sense that this descent could have been avoided if only the agency had treated its veterans better, if only they hadn't left capable men adrift. This wasn't simply about payback. It was about correcting a fundamental imbalance caused by the men who pulled the strings and then abandoned the instruments. The final confrontation was less a battle and more a necessary exorcism. The storm outside mirrored the internal maelstrom McCall had kept bottled up for years. In facing York, McCall wasn't just fighting a former colleague. He was fighting the person he might have become had he not found Susan and the quiet anchors of his later life. Each move was deliberate, precise, stripped of ego or wasted energy. It was the quiet equalizer demonstrating why he was still the master of his domain, because while others embraced the chaos for profit, McCall only embraced it to restore order, however violent that restoration might be. When the dust settled and the last breath left York, McCall felt only the familiar, grim satisfaction of a job done correctly, a debt paid in full, allowing him to return once more to the quiet pursuit of being just Robert. The air of finality that settled over the coastal aftermath was thick, yet strangely purifying for McCall. He stood for a moment, the relentless wind whipping at his coat, taking in the wreckage not with pride, but with the tired resignation of a craftsman surveying a necessary demolition. He was a specialist in necessary endings, and this one, the extinguishing of Dave York, felt particularly heavy because it involved extinguishing a piece of his own past. McCall's true motivation was rooted deeply in his foundational belief that even the most damaged individuals deserve to be seen, to have their stories acknowledged, something the agency actively tried to prevent. Susan was owed that acknowledgement. She had been a lifeline, a reminder that morality could exist even within the machinery of covert warfare. Her death was the final, definitive failure of the system they had both served, a system that consumed its best agents and discarded the evidence of their service. Reflecting on his own career, the narrative of McCall was one of perpetual reinvention. He was the ghost of multiple operative identities, each one defined by unparalleled efficiency in gathering intelligence or executing extraction. His inspiration wasn't grand ideology, it was the cold logic of protecting the innocent, a code he translated into the present by ensuring the local bakery owner didn't pay protection money, or that a young artist wasn't intimidated off his livelihood. These small victories were the antidote to the massive, often morally compromised victories of his former life. The confrontation with York had been visceral because York understood the language of commitment. York hadn't just betrayed the mission, he had betrayed the self-discipline required to leave the mission behind. McCall noticed the small details in York's heavily armed bunker, the same brand of tactical gear they favored in Beirut years ago, a grim sign that York had never truly moved on, only upgraded his employer. When the final blow was struck, it wasn't a surge of anger that propelled McCall, but a quiet, almost mournful recognition of inevitability. He saw in York the path of unchecked bitterness. McCall's own solace in his solitary apartment, the precise placement of his few belongings, and the quiet respect he commanded from his neighbors were evidence of a constant, conscious struggle to choose structure over chaos. Leaving the scene under the shroud of the retreating storm, McCall allowed himself one brief indulgence, a mental note to visit Susan's grave, not to mourn publicly, but to report his success in securing the truth, a final status update to the only person who might truly understand the cost. He was already fading back into the urban fabric, the man who existed between appointments, the shadow who ensured that for some, the quiet moments of life were truly safe, until the next necessary call pulled him from the silence. The world would never know Robert McCall, but they would feel the effects of his unseen vigilance. The return to the ordinary was always the most delicate maneuver for McCall. He slipped back into the rhythms of his Brooklyn existence, the transition from calculated violence to mundane routine requiring a subtle recalibration of his senses. The scent of industrial cleaner and ozone from the coastal shootout had to be replaced by the smell of fresh coffee brewing at the local bodega, the sound of distant sirens superseded by the familiar drone of city traffic. He found a strange comfort in the predictability of these small interactions, each one a brick reinforcing the wall between his current life and the abyss of his history. His interactions at the community center took on a renewed, almost urgent sincerity. He helped a young man, Antoine, struggling with basic arithmetic, guiding him patiently through the mechanics of algebra. This, McCall understood, was the real equalizer, providing the tools for self-sufficiency, not just temporary physical protection. Antoine, bright but lacking direction, represented the future that McCall was fighting to keep untainted by the kind of moral rot that consumed York. McCall remembered how his own entry into the shadow world had been predicated on a desperate need for purpose after a personal tragedy, a familiar trap that swallowed good intentions whole. Yet the shadows never fully receded. Even as he tutored Antoine, a part of his mind was still mapping escape routes, cataloging the structural weaknesses of the center, a necessary paranoia that retirement could never fully erase. This internal duality was his constant companion, the warm hand resting on a student's shoulder, masking the muscle memory capable of breaking a man's neck with casual force. He had developed a meticulous system for compartmentalizing these selves, a technique learned during his most demanding psychological conditioning sessions, acknowledge the capability, but anchor the intention firmly in the present good. Days later, a subtle anomaly in his routine pulled his attention. A specific, almost archaic newspaper clipping, a review of a decades-old play perhaps, had been left tucked inside a book he had loaned out. It was a dead drop, a signaling method so outdated it could only have been deployed by someone from the very earliest strata of his CIA history, someone who predated digital communication entirely. This was not York's work. This was a signal from the high command, suggesting that the loose ends McCall had tied up had, in fact, snagged a much larger, far more powerful entity. The message was simple, encoded in the typography and the specific phrasing of the obscure review. The audit is complete. Prepare for debriefing. This transmission ignited a cold sense of dread. Debriefing, in the agency's lexicon, rarely meant a pleasant conversation over coffee. It meant assessment, potential reactivation, or, most likely, permanent neutralization, now that he had proven capable of investigating their black operations successfully. McCall understood that in exposing York, he hadn't closed the case. He had merely announced his presence back onto the board. The quiet life was officially over. He began the preparations not with panic, but with the grim efficiency of a man assembling gear for a journey he knew would be treacherous, perhaps his last. He needed to anticipate the next move, to strike before the unseen architects of the conspiracy could orchestrate his final, quiet disappearance. The realization that the signal wasn't a threat, but an invitation. A summons back to the machinery he'd so painstakingly dismantled his life around sent a deep tremor through McCall's practiced calm. The newspaper clipping, brittle and smelling faintly of aged paper and stored neglect, was a relic from a world he'd paid for with years of his best life. It spoke of an audit, a term that echoed the brutal internal reviews conducted after major intelligence failures, reviews where the cleanest solution was always to eliminate the operational residue. And McCall was certainly residue. His mind immediately raced back to his early days, to the harsh environments where operational security was paramount, and where the concept of retirement was understood as merely a temporary staging period before reassignment. He thought of his early mentor, a man known only as the Professor, who taught him that every system, no matter how complex, always had a central exploitable vulnerability, often located in the hubris of its most powerful leaders. That clipping suggested the hubris was now directing his way. McCall began his counter-preparation not by leaving, but by deepening his roots. If they wanted to find him, they would have to work for it, and he wanted them to work through the vibrant community he protected. He quietly ensured Antoine had a new scholarship application ready, linking him tangentially to a reputable, if obscure, university contact he maintained from his days monitoring academic espionage. He made sure the local pharmacist, who supplied him with specialized, untraceable medical supplies, had an ironclad alibi for the upcoming week. The emotional landscape shifted from grief and righteous anger to a cold, strategic vigilance. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was defending the integrity of the small space he had carved out of the world's indifference. He retrieved his contingency kit, stored beneath the floorboards of his small apartment. Not the heavy weaponry of his operative past, but tools focused on evasion, disguise, and silent neutralization. A set of lock-picking implements crafted from specialized dental tools, a small vial of fast-acting sedative, and several pre-stamped encrypted return address envelopes destined for safe houses across 3 continents. He knew the agency's play. They would try to frame his actions against York as a rogue incident, or worse, use his investigation as an excuse to bring him in for re-education. The debriefing wasn't about answering questions, it was about assessment before execution. McCall felt a familiar, almost nostalgic surge of focus. He understood their protocol better than they did because he helped write the manual on how to disappear. He didn't wait for the inevitable physical approach. He needed to seize the initiative, to make them react to him. The next step, he decided, would be to send a message back into the network, a subtle ripple indicating he knew where the audit truly began. This required contacting the one person who might still owe him a favor from their shared, brutal past in Eastern Europe, a brilliant but deeply paranoid signals analyst named Val, now living off the grid somewhere in the American Southwest. Val was the key to tracing the digital signature behind the archaic newspaper drop. It was time to leverage the ghosts one last time, turning their inevitable return into his calculated offensive. The decision to reach out to Val was a heavy one, carrying the risk of exposing another soul to the agency's unforgiving scrutiny. Val was a master of signals intelligence, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to seeing without being seen, a temperament forged in the constant surveillance of Eastern Bloc operations. McCall remembered Val not for his combat prowess, but for the eerie silence he maintained even when under intense duress, a quietude that unnerved even the most hardened interrogators. If anyone could peel back the layers of obfuscation covering the audit's true origin, it would be Val. McCall enacted the contact procedure with painstaking slowness, using a series of compromised payphones across several boroughs, each call lasting no more than 5 seconds, just long enough to transmit a single encrypted coordinate sequence. He didn't use conventional frequencies. Instead, he modulated the signal onto the background noise of emergency broadcast system tests, an almost invisible layer of static that only someone actively listening for anomalies would detect. While waiting for Val's response, McCall turned his attention to the local environment, observing the subtle changes in pattern that suggested he was already being watched, albeit subtly. The usual street vendors seemed slightly more stationary. A delivery van that always parked on the far corner now idled directly across from his building for hours. These were not the heavy-handed tactics of uniformed police. These were the professional adjustments of seasoned intelligence watchers, operatives trained to blend into the background noise of urban life. They were testing the perimeter, trying to gauge his reaction time. He found a quiet satisfaction in knowing they were nervous. His swift, decisive action against York had demonstrated he was not a retired man seeking comfort, but a fully operational asset refusing to be controlled. This refusal was his greatest weapon. When Val finally responded, it wasn't through a direct line, but via a secure message embedded in a digital feed from a public library webcam in Arizona, a grainy image of a shelf where a specific book was slightly ajar. The message was short. The ghost is in the mainframe. They are using old architecture for new eyes. The source traces back to the DC. Annex. Old Black Site Gamma. Black Site Gamma. The very mention of it made the air feel colder. That location was where McCall had been rebuilt after his deepest operational scarring, a place of intense psychological reprogramming. The fact that the audit originated there meant the decision to neutralize him was likely being overseen by one of the original architects of his own operative persona, perhaps even his former section chief, a man McCall deeply respected but whose ruthlessness was legendary. This was no longer about honoring Susan. It was about survival and the reclaiming of his own narrative. If they held the key to his conditioning, they controlled his limits. McCall realized he couldn't fight them from Brooklyn. He needed to go to the center of the storm. He packed a single utilitarian duffel bag, ensuring his best suit, dark, unassuming, the perfect camouflage for a man attending a high-level, unwanted meeting, was packed neatly. The man who helped kids with algebra was about to attend a meeting with ghosts, and he was determined to ensure that this time he would be the one setting the curriculum. The journey to D began before dawn, blending seamlessly into the early commuter rush, the shadow accelerating toward the heart of the machine. The journey toward Washington, D was a masterclass in calculated invisibility. McCall traveled primarily by rail, a method that allowed him to observe the passage of time and space without the need for traceable air travel or the heavy footprint of rental vehicles. He moved through the crowded carriages like a drop of oil in water, present yet never fully mixing. He maintained constant low-level vigilance, occasionally using the reflective surfaces of train windows to monitor the passengers behind him, seeking the telltale signs of the watchers Val had warned him about. The atmosphere within the train car offered a brief, almost poignant contrast to the gravity of his mission. He watched families sharing snacks, students absorbed in textbooks, ordinary lives unfolding without the shadow of clandestine warfare hanging over them. This normalcy was the prize he fought for, the reason he endured the brutal necessity of returning to the fight. Every face represented a stake in the life he was trying to preserve. Upon arrival in the sprawling chaos of Union Station, the surveillance presence became immediately more sophisticated. These watchers were not the local patrols he'd evaded in Brooklyn. These were professional hounds, likely former colleagues who knew his operational signature intimately. They were subtle. The man reading a newspaper upside down near the exit, the woman engrossed in her phone who kept angling her body slightly toward the main thoroughfare. McCall recognized the patience of men who believed they had all the time in the world before the final move. He bypassed the main exits, instead utilizing an old maintenance tunnel network he recalled from a reconnaissance mission decades prior, a forgotten artery beneath the station that emptied out near a discreet loading dock. The tunnel was choked with dust and the metallic tang of decay, a fitting passage back into the operational dark. Black Site Gamma, as Val indicated, was cleverly disguised, situated beneath a seemingly innocuous, government-owned administrative building that handled historical archives, a perfect cover for storing secrets and controlling access to sensitive personnel files. McCall needed an entry vector that was not brute force, but an exploitation of systemic weakness. He initiated contact with a retired agency cryptographer named Elias, whom he'd once saved from a disastrous defection attempt in Vienna. Elias was now a recluse, but he held the digital keys to the older, less frequently updated security systems that Gamma relied upon. McCall didn't call Elias. He sent a single, almost poetic coded message, a quote from a specific obscure philosopher they both admired, to a dead-drop email address Elias used only for emergencies. The reply came hours later, an encrypted decryption key and a single, chilling confirmation. The head of the audit was indeed Julian Thorne, McCall's former handler, the man who believed operational purity could only be achieved through absolute control. Thorne hadn't just been supervising the cleanup of the Susan Plummer case. He was orchestrating a purge of every agent who knew the truth about a massive, ongoing financial conspiracy that Susan had inadvertently uncovered. McCall stared at the decrypted file on his burner laptop. The scale of the cover-up was staggering. His path to survival was clear. He couldn't just survive the debriefing. He had to expose the operation from within. He needed to get Thorne to believe he was willingly returning to the fold, only to turn the tables when the systemic vulnerability, the archaic architecture of Gamma, was laid bare before him. He dressed in the dark suit, the armor of the bureaucrat, ready to walk into the belly of the beast with the quiet determination of a man about to conduct the final, most important audit of all. McCall's infiltration of the administrative building housing Black Site Gamma was seamless, a testament to how thoroughly an operative can learn the blind spots of his own creation. He presented himself not as an intruder, but as an urgent, late-night internal auditor summoned from a remote facility, utilizing the access credentials Elias had so efficiently provided. The suit felt like a second skin, transforming the warrior into a bureaucrat, the perfect camouflage in an environment where paper trails mattered more than bullets. Inside the sterile, beige corridors, the silence was profound. The manufactured quiet of a place designed to suppress sound and memory. He navigated the security checkpoints using techniques designed to exploit human pattern recognition failure, moving slightly too fast for casual observation, carrying himself with an air of absolute authority that discouraged questioning. He passed junior analysts who recognized the gravity of his assumed clearance, but were too intimidated or too inexperienced to challenge his presence. Julian Thorne was waiting in the central monitoring room, a space bristling with monitors displaying schematics of the agency's global network, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of data streams. Thorne, ever the intellectual mercenary, looked unchanged, impeccably dressed, his expression a mask of weary dedication. He had always viewed loyalty as a transactional commodity, and McCall suspected Thorne genuinely believed he was saving the agency by eliminating inconvenient truths, Susan being the first sacrifice. "Robert," Thorne greeted him, his voice devoid of surprise, carrying only the crisp finality of a commander reviewing a failed mission report. "You're late for the review. I expected you sooner, given your propensity for dramatic exits." McCall allowed a flicker of weary respect to cross his face. "The traffic on the 95 was unexpected, Julian. I see you've kept Gamma functional. A bit nostalgic, isn't it? Relying on architecture from the 90s to run 21st century Black Ops?" This was the opening. McCall immediately steered the conversation away from Susan and toward the conspiracy Val had alluded to, the financial irregularities that Susan had stumbled upon. He spoke with calculated concern, adopting the role of the loyal, albeit recently distracted, asset. He needed Thorne to believe McCall was motivated by the same fear of exposure that drove him. "The cleanup was thorough," McCall continued, leaning against a console. His posture relaxed, but every muscle coiled. "York was sloppy. He was never meant to tie the loose ends from Istanbul. He was supposed to secure the assets. You pushed him too hard." Thorne smirked, a brief, unpleasant gesture. "York was expendable. His failure was his lack of discretion. You, Robert, are different. You understand the necessity of the greater good. Susan did not. She romanticized the targets." Thorne gestured to a screen displaying encrypted ledgers. "This conspiracy, the money laundering that funds our more delicate extractions, it's vast. We clean up the mess, not just the symptoms." McCall met his gaze, locking their eyes across the distance. He knew Thorne's weakness, an overestimation of his own intellectual control. McCall began to work his real objective, the exploitation of the archaic architecture. While Thorne lectured on fiscal necessity, McCall subtly initiated Elias's backdoor program through a low-level diagnostic port he'd casually leaned against earlier. The program wasn't a destructive virus. It was a cascading series of data mirrors designed to copy the entirety of the active conspiracy files and simultaneously broadcast them, unencrypted, through the public-facing, highly visible servers of the D-Archives building, the very building Gamma was hidden beneath. "I understand control, Julian," McCall stated, his voice low and steady as the data transfer neared completion. "But control is only effective when the controller is the only one in the room who knows the rules of engagement." Susan tried to reveal the truth. "I'm simply ensuring that the evidence of your greater good is preserved where it can do the most damage to those who authorized it." As the final data packet sent, McCall shifted his weight. The transformation was instantaneous. The bureaucratic veneer cracked, revealing the kinetic force underneath. Thorne's eyes widened, recognizing the telltale sign of true betrayal, not of the agency, but of Thorne's absolute control. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick with latent violence. McCall moved not to attack Thorne, but to the central server rack, his objective now to ensure the hard lockdown of the local environment, trapping the watchers outside while he ensured the exposure went through. The quiet man had just detonated a truth bomb in the heart of the intelligence community, and the ensuing chaos would be his final escape route. The moment the data cascade initiated, the sterile environment of Black Site Gamma fractured. The sudden, panicked blaring of local alarms replaced the low hum of electronic surveillance, a sound McCall recognized as the system choking on its own complexity. Julian Thorne's mask of weary dedication disintegrated, replaced by raw, cornered fury. He lunged not for a sidearm, which he rarely carried in his control room, but for the manual override panel, intending to sever the external network link. "You self-destructive fool, Robert! You've destroyed the leverage!" Thorne roared, his voice echoing off the metal bulkheads. He understood that the evidence, once distributed onto public servers, would trigger independent investigations far beyond the agency's ability to swiftly contain. McCall intercepted him with the practiced economy of motion that defined his career. He didn't waste energy on a protracted brawl. He applied pressure exactly where it mattered. A swift, precise strike to the brachial plexus rendered Thorne's arm useless, dropping him halfway to the override panel. McCall didn't gloat. The act was surgical, a demonstration of remaining competence, not malice. "You confused control with omniscience, Julian," McCall murmured, steadying the now flashing server housing. "The leverage was always in the truth, not the suppression of it." Susan knew that. With Thorne incapacitated and the data upload confirmed, a cascade of classified documents and financial trails now being indexed by unsuspecting government archivists, McCall turned his attention to egress. He knew the outer perimeter would already be swarming. The security teams they had planted to watch him were now locked in with him, their professional protocols demanding they secure the breach site, which now included McCall himself. He didn't rely on the main elevators. Instead, he moved to the emergency ventilation shaft, a route he had personally helped design during the site's initial construction 15 years prior, knowing that maintenance logs were notoriously neglected. He shed the expensive suit jacket, revealing the practical dark undershirt and reinforced tactical webbing he had worn beneath. The transition from bureaucrat to operative was completed in seconds. As he squeezed into the narrow shaft, the sounds of organized tactical entry echoed from the floors below. Shouts, the heavy thud of boots, the controlled blasts of breaching charges. They were moving with the precision McCall had taught them, but now they were targeting him. He could hear the faint crackle of radio chatter, recognizing the call signs of men he had once trained to be his backup. They were hunting their own creation. McCall utilized the shaft structure to move laterally toward the building's periphery, away from the main command center where Thorne lay. He was not running. He was relocating to a more advantageous operational theater. He remembered the specifications. The ventilation system emptied near a rarely used subterranean boiler room connected to the city's old utility grid. Emerging into the damp, echoing space of the boiler room, the air thick with steam and the metallic scent of rust, McCall paused only long enough to ensure his exit was obscured. He could hear the muffled, frustrated shouts of the retrieval teams, realizing he had bypassed their primary internal containment. He blended into the utility tunnels, moving quickly through the darkness beneath D. This was the environment where Robert McCall truly thrived, unseen, unmapped, relying on subterranean knowledge and instinct honed over decades of operating outside the official gaze. He wasn't heading back to Brooklyn. The exposure meant his quiet life was irrevocably compromised. He needed to disappear again, truly disappear this time, perhaps farther south than ever before. The victory over Thorne was costly. It purchased his freedom, but it demanded the final, absolute erasure of Robert McCall, the neighborhood guardian, leaving only the nameless Equalizer to navigate the coming storm. The echoes of his past had finally caught up, but this time he ensured they would echo across the headlines of the entire city. The utility tunnels were a temporary reprieve, a damp, forgotten labyrinth beneath the gleaming edifice of federal power. McCall moved with a ghost's efficiency, the silence of the stone and rusted metal amplifying the frantic energy he could still feel radiating from the building above. The systemic panic caused by Thorne's unmasking. He was aware that the agency would now enter a state of existential crisis, their primary concern shifting from containing a rogue agent to managing the public fallout of a massive financial scandal rooted in their covert operations. For McCall, this chaos was the necessary smokescreen. He reached the designated exit point, a crumbling access hatch disguised beneath a manhole cover in a seldom-used industrial district several blocks from the archives building. As he prepared to ascend, he paused, not out of hesitation, but to execute one final, necessary piece of business. He activated a satellite burst transmission from the burner phone, directing it not toward Val or any old contact, but toward a specific, highly respected investigative journalist known for his tenacity in uncovering systemic corruption. A man McCall had observed from afar, recognizing a similar, almost stubborn dedication to factual truth. The transmission contained a carefully curated selection of the evidence lifted from Gamma, enough to guarantee the story would break wide, undeniable, and impossible for the agency to suppress entirely. Emerging onto the cold, wet pavement under the thin veil of pre-dawn light, McCall felt the city shift around him. He was no longer just a commuter. He was the epicenter of a brewing storm. He needed to move beyond the immediate radius before the inevitable dragnet tightened around D. He stripped off the remnants of his tactical gear, discarding them into an industrial waste receptacle marked for hazardous chemical disposal, a final misdirection. He was left in simple, dark clothing, looking for all the world like a man weathering an early morning delivery route. His destination was the Greyhound Terminal, an interchange notorious for its anonymity and constant flow of transient populations. He bought a one-way ticket south, paying in cash for a destination so far removed from the East Coast power centers that it offered a logistical nightmare for any immediate pursuit team, a small, dusty border town in New Mexico known only for its remoteness. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, slicing through the morning fog, McCall leaned his head against the vibrating window. He wasn't feeling relief. He was feeling the profound emptiness that followed the cessation of extreme purpose. He had avenged Susan by destroying the very structure that enabled her death. He had ensured the truth would surface. But the victory was isolating. He had just severed his last viable connection to the world he understood, the world of structured conflict and identifiable enemies. Looking out at the receding skyline of the capital, McCall understood that his next phase would not be defined by fighting a tangible enemy, but by surviving the void. There would be no more community centers, no more local injustices to right with swift violence, at least not immediately. He was returning to the purest form of his existence, the self-contained operative, existing purely on preparation and necessity. He would have to rebuild his existence from zero, perhaps cultivating a new identity so meticulously that even the ghosts of his past, now energized by the collapse of Gamma, would struggle to find the thread. The road ahead was unmarked territory, but as the bus gained speed, carrying him toward the arid silence of the Southwest, McCall felt a strange, settling peace. The Equalizer had balanced the scales one last time, and now he could finally afford to be nothing at all. The endless ribbon of asphalt unwound beneath the Greyhound, a physical manifestation of the blank slate McCall was now embracing. The journey south was deliberately slow, forcing a prolonged period of enforced stillness where his mind could process the seismic shift he had engineered. He observed the shifting landscape, the gradual transition from the manicured, power-laden green of the mid-Atlantic to the harsher, sun-bleached expanse of the American interior. This transition mirrored his own internal retreat, shedding the heavy weight of responsibility for the stark reality of absolute self-reliance. His cash reserves were substantial, drawn from the operational black accounts he had maintained through layers of digital obfuscation. Funds that the agency would never be able to trace back to the systemic fraud he had just exposed, as those records were now in the public domain. He understood that wealth, for an operative like him, was not about luxury. It was about untraceable mobility and the ability to acquire necessary tools without leaving a digital footprint. In the confines of the bus, he practiced the art of deliberate inconspicuousness. He studied the other passengers, not as potential threats, but as case studies in blending in. He adopted the posture of a weary laborer seeking work, allowing his face, which carried the lines of a life lived under immense pressure, to be interpreted as simple exhaustion rather than coiled readiness. He minimized eye contact, a practiced discipline that kept him invisible in plain sight. The weight of Susan's memory, however, remained a constant ballast. He had secured justice for her, but the cost was the complete dissolution of his current anchor. He realized that his capacity for forming genuine attachments was severely limited by his very nature. Every connection he forged became a vulnerability the system would inevitably exploit. This was the hard truth his life in the shadows had taught him, a lesson reinforced by Thorne's betrayal. As the bus traversed the vast, empty stretches of Texas, McCall began the meticulous process of creating his next phantom identity. He recalled the meticulous records he had prepared years ago for just such an eventuality, a file detailing a potential life as a long-haul independent trucker, using a fabricated past rooted in maritime law enforcement in the Pacific Northwest. He began mentally adopting the jargon, the gait, the very way this new persona would interact with the world. When the bus finally rolled into the dusty, sun-scorched terminal of his remote New Mexico destination, the air was thin and dry, a sharp contrast to the humidity of D. The town was small, built around the skeleton of an old mining operation, offering anonymity through sheer lack of interest from the outside world. It was the perfect place to wait, to observe the fallout of the gamma leak, and to let the dust settle. McCall walked away from the terminal, not looking back. He found the small abandoned property he had researched remotely months before, a cinder-block structure far enough from the town center to ensure privacy. As he surveyed the desolate horizon, the setting sun painting the distant mesas in shades of violent orange and deep purple, he knew the silence here was different from the forced silence of Brooklyn. This was the silence of the wilderness, a place where he could rebuild his defenses, layer by agonizing layer. He had won the battle against the agency's corruption, but the war against his own inescapable history had simply moved to a new, more isolated front. His next challenge would be maintaining the illusion of vacancy, guarding the stillness against the inevitable, sophisticated reach of a betrayed intelligence apparatus. The Equalizer 2, a direct continuation of Denzel Washington's compelling turn as Robert McCall, deepens the exploration of a man wrestling with his violent past while attempting to anchor himself in a semblance of normalcy. It's a film less concerned with intricate plot machinations and more focused on the moral calculus of targeted retribution. McCall, operating now as a near-mythological figure dispensing justice for the truly downtrodden, finds his self-imposed monastic life in a Brooklyn bookshop irrevocably shattered by the murder of Susan Plummer, his former case officer and closest confidant. This tragedy serves as the narrative catalyst, forcing McCall out of his carefully constructed routine. His initial acts are methodical, almost ritualistic, investigating Susan's death with the same precision he once applied in his CIA black operations. The film subtly contrasts McCall's structured existence, his detailed notes on neighborhood needs, his commitment to his elderly neighbors, his part-time work driving for a ride-share service, with the brutal chaos he is invariably drawn back into. This juxtaposition highlights the core conflict of the character, the desire for atonement versus the innate, honed capacity for extreme violence. Antoine Fuqua, returning to direct, maintains the stylish, deliberately paced aesthetic established in the first installment. The action sequences, while infrequent compared to standard thrillers, are characterized by McCall's almost surgical application of force. We see the influence of his former life as a black ops operative, the almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, the ability to weaponize everyday objects, and the reliance on precise timing, often measured down to the second, as seen in his methodical takedowns. This competence, however, is presented not as a triumphant display of skill, but as a burdensome necessity. The film attempts to flesh out McCall's motivations by drawing connections between Susan's investigation and a complex cover-up involving mercenaries operating under the guise of private security contractors. This plot strand introduces a degree of professional parody, forcing McCall to confront adversaries who possess similar training, though lacking his ethical compass. The thematic thread running through this conflict is loyalty, and the price paid for refusing to play the long game of institutional corruption. Susan Plummer represented a link to his past life, a tether to the man he was, and her death represents the ultimate violation of his present sanctuary. The introduction of Michael Gattani as the antagonist, a former colleague turned operative working for the shadowy forces responsible, establishes a direct foil for McCall. This dynamic harkens back to classic revenge narratives, where the hero must overcome a dark mirror image of himself. However, the film sometimes struggles under the weight of exposition required to detail the conspiracy, occasionally slowing the momentum built by Washington's commanding screen presence. Beyond the main arc, the film dedicates significant time to McCall's mentorship of Miles Whitaker, a talented but directionless young man living in his apartment complex. This relationship provides necessary grounding, offering McCall an opportunity to invest in a future other than his own perpetual cycle of vengeance. Miles's artistic aspirations, in stark contrast to McCall's utilitarian violence, underscore the film's underlying message about finding purpose, whether through creation or through forceful correction. This element of surrogate fatherhood speaks to Washington's own career trajectory, which often incorporates roles defined by moral authority and quiet guardianship. Ultimately, The Equalizer 2 succeeds primarily due to Washington's nuanced performance. He conveys the profound weariness of a man who knows he can never truly retire from being the protector, the equalizer. The finale, set against a raging hurricane, provides a suitably dramatic and visually arresting conclusion, washing away the immediate threat while leaving the existential weight of McCall's duty firmly intact. It is a meditation on whether true redemption is achievable through acts of violence, concluding that for a man like Robert McCall, justice is simply the necessary prerequisite for a moment's peace. The palpable sense of duty that clings to Robert McCall is what makes his occasional bursts of calculated brutality so compelling, not thrilling in the conventional sense, but terrifying in their inevitability. Washington embodies this weariness not just in his dialogue, which is sparse and impactful, but in the slight slump of his shoulders when he returns to his sparse apartment, a physical manifestation of carrying the weight of every life he has saved and every life he has taken. His interaction with the community, the precise way he organizes groceries for Mrs. Rodriguez, the earnest advice he dispenses to Miles about avoiding the pitfalls of street life, are micro-rituals designed to reinforce the facade of ordinary citizenship, a desperate attempt to tether himself to the mundane reality that justice demands he constantly abandon. Susan Plummer's death acts as a specific kind of rupture, not merely a personal loss, but an institutional betrayal. She was the one person who understood the architecture of his past, the years spent performing lethal services for agencies like the Defense Intelligence Agency, and presumably the one person who sanctioned his current, limited form of vigilante work. When McCall investigates, he isn't just seeking revenge. He is conducting a forensic audit of his own compromised system of peace. The film hints at the deep-seated rot within the intelligence community, where former assets are deemed liabilities and eliminated when they get too close to inconvenient truths. This speaks volumes about the paranoia inherent in McCall's former career, a career built on eliminating threats before they materialize, a skill set that now turns inward upon his protectors. The action choreography reflects McCall's age and his deliberate approach. Unlike younger, frenetic action heroes, McCall conserves energy. Every punch, every tripwire activation, every carefully placed nail driven into a doorframe for effect is economical. This precision elevates the violence to an almost artisanal level. He crafts scenarios where his opponents are beaten not just physically, but logistically. When he uses a roll of duct tape or a heavy book in a fight, it is a direct statement. The environment itself is his arsenal, a testament to the comprehensive training drilled into operatives who are meant to function invisibly within any setting. Miles, the young artist, serves as the emotional proxy for the audience. His admiration for McCall is tinged with awe and fear. He sees the raw power and the rigid discipline, but perhaps not the soul-crushing necessity behind it. McCall's investment in Miles is his quiet rebellion against the cycle of violence, a conscious effort to cultivate life rather than extinguish threat. Washington, who has built a career on portraying figures of towering moral rectitude, from Malcolm X to the conflicted police captain in Training Day, lends this paternal dynamic a gravity that prevents it from feeling sentimental. It feels like an obligation to the future, a small counterweight to the darkness of his past. The climactic confrontation in the hurricane, while visually spectacular, shifts the tone toward operatic excess. The storm mirrors the internal chaos McCall has suppressed for so long. It is a cleansing externalization of his internal turmoil, where he can finally operate at full throttle, unburdened by the need to remain unnoticed. In that deluge, the lines blur between the necessary executioner and the haunted man, resulting in a satisfyingly brutal resolution that closes the immediate case, but leaves the audience with the lingering, unsettling impression that for Robert McCall, the role of the Equalizer is not a job he completes, but a condition he endures. The deliberate slowness of McCall's movements outside of combat underscores the profound effort it takes for him to simply exist as a civilian. He observes his world with the practiced stillness of a predator in repose, every glance cataloging potential threats or vulnerabilities within his neighborhood ecosystem. This hyper-awareness is a perpetual burden. He cannot truly relax because relaxation implies a lapse in vigilance, a condition that directly led to Susan's death. His meticulous organization, the color coding of his notes, the perfect alignment of his few possessions, is a desperate attempt to impose absolute control over a small corner of his universe, a countermeasure against the chaos unleashed by institutional betrayal. The film subtly explores the trauma inherent in hypercompetence. McCall is not merely skilled, he is fundamentally altered by his previous life. This is most apparent in his interactions with the rideshare passengers, where his polite demeanor thinly veils a readiness to deploy extreme prejudice against any hint of malice directed at his fares. He is a living weapon housed in the unassuming shell of a neighborhood benefactor. When he learns the details of Susan's execution, how she was lured into a trap designed to look like an accident or a simple robbery gone wrong, the cold, institutional nature of the kill triggers a deeper, more personal rage than simple street violence ever could. Susan was his anchor to the thin ethical line he attempts to walk. Eliminating her was a declaration by the shadowy forces that his retirement was conditional, revocable at their discretion. The film draws heavily on the trope of the retired operative dragged back into the fold, but elevates it through Washington's gravitas. He never plays McCall as a joy in violence. The satisfaction, if any, is derived purely from the restoration of order, however temporary or locally applied. The antagonists, comprised largely of highly trained ex-military contractors, are depicted as mercenaries without conscience, fundamentally lacking the internal struggle that defines McCall. They are transactional killers. McCall, by contrast, is driven by a distorted sense of obligation that borders on penance. Miles's role becomes increasingly significant as the film progresses. He represents the possibility of an unblemished future, a life not defined by the necessity of preemptive violence. McCall's lessons to Miles extend beyond merely dodging trouble. They are lessons in self-possession and the recognition of genuine threat, lessons rooted in the survival training McCall himself received. The contrast between Miles sketching vibrant, hopeful images and McCall methodically gathering components for makeshift weaponry highlights the chasm between creation and necessary destruction that McCall can no longer bridge for himself. His mentorship is an investment in the world he hopes to leave behind, a world where figures like himself are obsolete. The final confrontation, shrouded in the blinding rain and wind, is less a battle and more an exorcism, a final necessary purging before the quiet he craves can perhaps finally settle around him. Even then, the silence that follows is tinged with the knowledge that the systems that created and then targeted Susan Plummer remain firmly in place. The underlying tension that permeates the film stems from the precarious nature of McCall's self-made justice system operating within the very societal framework he claims to uphold. His actions, while morally sound in their targeting of abusers and exploiters, are fundamentally anarchic. The film skirts around the legal ramifications of his vigilantism, focusing instead on the emotional and personal cost. This cost is most vividly displayed in the rare moments when McCall permits himself vulnerability, usually around the small, diverse community he quietly protects in his neighborhood. These interactions are loaded. Every shared smile with a local shopkeeper is a deliberate reinforcement of the good he is fighting to preserve, a tangible representation of the why behind the gruesome work he must perform elsewhere. The geography of the film itself mirrors McCall's internal landscape. The bustling yet intimate setting of the apartment complex contrasts sharply with the sterile, impersonal environments where the conspiracy unfolds, the corporate offices, the anonymous highways. He is always an outsider, whether he is infiltrating a secure facility using his master key skills or simply sitting silently on the subway observing human behavior. This perpetual isolation is the defining characteristic of his existence post-CIA. Denzel Washington conveys this isolation not through overt sadness, but through an almost unnerving stillness, suggesting a man who has successfully walled off his emotions to maintain operational effectiveness. The narrative's reliance on the theme of institutional memory, the idea that the intelligence community never truly forgets or forgives its assets, provides a rich, albeit shadowy, backdrop. Susan Plummer's death is the cinematic equivalent of a recall notice. For the powers that be, McCall and Plummer represented loose ends, individuals who witnessed too much and possessed too much independent moral judgment. The mercenaries sent after McCall are placeholders for the systemic rot. They lack the tortured morality that makes McCall interesting. They simply follow orders, making their defeat less about a triumph of good over evil, and more about the superior tactical planning of a man fighting for his very right to self-determination outside the lines of government control. The film suggests that true loyalty resides only with those who share one's immediate burden, a theme powerfully underscored by the silent pact between McCall and the few people he allows himself to care for. The decision to frame the final confrontation amidst a raging hurricane serves as a powerful, if somewhat heavy-handed metaphor for McCall's inner turmoil finally boiling over into external chaos. The storm strips away the pretenses of civilized life and the need for stealth, allowing McCall to operate with the full, terrifying scope of his abilities without restraint. In the driving rain and roaring wind, his actions become less about calculated strategy and more about cathartic release. This environment is the only place where his capacity for overwhelming force aligns perfectly with the external world, temporarily dissolving the dissonance between the quiet man in the bookstore and the lethal operative. Washington plays these final sequences with a focused intensity that borders on trance-like. There is no room for hesitation. Every necessary dispatch is executed with the finality of a judge's gavel. This is where the film leans hardest into the mythology of the Equalizer, a force of nature responding to an unnatural disruption. The film suggests that for a man whose life was built on secrets and shadow work, true reckoning can only occur when the world itself reflects that turbulence. The methodical way he engineers the deaths of the remaining mercenaries, using the environment as both shield and weapon, is the ultimate expression of his comprehensive training, honed by years of suppressed guilt. Furthermore, the film uses the contrast between McCall's destructive final acts and his gentle care for the community to articulate his complex moral code. He eradicates threats with ruthless efficiency, yet returns immediately to tending to his small circle of dependents. This duality reinforces that his violence is not for personal gain or thrill, but a burdensome mechanism of defense for the innocent lives he has chosen to protect. His relationship with Miles, in particular, acts as a moral compass. By ensuring Miles survives this ordeal and continues on his path of creation, McCall validates his own existence, that even through violence, a positive outcome, a preserved future, is possible. The quiet aftermath, where the storm subsides and McCall simply walks away into the wet dawn, speaks volumes about his perpetual exile. He cannot rejoin the world he saves. He can only ensure its continuation from the periphery, forever the necessary ghost. The film's commitment to portraying McCall as a man perpetually at war with his own nature is evident in the minute details of his routine. Observe, for instance, his interactions at the local deli. The practiced nod to the proprietor, the slight hesitation before accepting change, the way his gaze sweeps the entrance before he turns his back to the counter. These are not simply character quirks, they are defense mechanisms, the constant calibration of a highly specialized instrument forced into civilian use. He is always on, and the rare instances where he seems to genuinely connect with someone, like sharing a quiet moment of understanding with a fellow driver, feel almost like minor betrayals of his self-imposed isolation. This forced authenticity is taxing, and Washington allows the audience to feel that exhaustion seep through the fabric of McCall's composure. The professional adversaries McCall faces in this installment, being products of the same Black Ops world, understand his playbook on an intimate level. This elevates the tension because the confrontations become less about brute force winning out and more about which operative possesses the superior foresight and psychological endurance. The antagonists are driven by contracts and self-preservation. McCall is driven by a profound, aching sense of responsibility toward Susan, a responsibility that transcends contracts. This difference in motivation is what ultimately allows him to anticipate their moves. They are playing a game of employment, while he is fighting for moral absolution. The audience understands that defeating these men is not just about survival. It is about validating the life Susan believed he could still lead honorably. The narrative structure, moving from the intimate setting of Brooklyn to the wider, shadowy confines of international contractors, mirrors McCall's own expanding sphere of necessary engagement. He is dragged from his local fight to confront the very systems that produced him. This escalation suggests that true peace for a man like McCall is unattainable as long as the machinery of covert violence continues to operate unchecked. His decision to systematically dismantle the organization responsible for Susan's death is a declaration that he will not allow his former employers to clean up their messes by eliminating their own ethically conscious members. It is a stand against impunity, enacted with the chilling efficiency of a man who has nothing left to lose but the memory of his integrity. The entire endeavor is framed as a necessary, albeit gruesome, act of maintenance on the world's broken moral structure. The very texture of the film seems saturated with McCall's melancholy. It is not the explosive melancholy of a man seeking revenge for petty slights, but the deep, settled sorrow of someone who understands the permanence of his own damage. This is perhaps best evidenced in the contrast between his precise actions and the quiet dignity of the old men he plays chess with in the park. These games are microcosms of his life, governed by strict, ancient rules, requiring intense concentration and ultimately leading to a temporary conclusion before the board is inevitably reset. He plays to understand structure, a structure that violence has forced him to inhabit. His career background, years spent as a ghost, an operative whose existence was supposed to be erased the moment his mission ended, informs every interaction. When he drives his passengers, he is acutely aware of the blind spots in traffic, the reflections in storefront windows, the sound of an approaching footstep that doesn't quite match the rhythm of the urban flow. This hypervigilance is a form of self-torture, a constant reminder that the training designed to protect the state has rendered him incapable of truly belonging to the society he protects. Denzel Washington imbues these moments with a subtle tension. His eyes rarely rest, suggesting an internal monologue constantly running threat assessments. The film handles the morality of his violence carefully, framing it as a painful necessity rather than an empowering choice. When McCall eliminates the mercenary who betrayed Susan, there is no triumphant roar, only a swift professional termination followed by an immediate retreat back into the shadows. This refusal to savor the kill speaks to his deeper aspiration, to render the world safe enough that he no longer needs to be the equalizer. This hope, however faint, is vested in Miles. The mentorship is McCall's attempt to plant a seed of genuine creation, art, in a world he can only navigate through destruction. Miles's youthful optimism acts as a necessary foil, highlighting the purity of the life McCall forfeited long ago. The antagonists, especially the one closest to Susan's orbit, represent the allure of a comfortable complicity. They chose the paycheck over the conscience, a path McCall actively rejected, even when he wore the uniform. Their defeat is therefore a reaffirmation of the difficult, lonely path of moral accountability that Susan's legacy demands of him. The final violent outburst against this backdrop of routine maintenance is McCall's necessary, if tragic, admission. Until the corruption that killed Susan is eradicated, his quiet life remains a fragile, undeserved reprieve. The very environment of the final confrontation, the raging hurricane, acts as a metaphysical cleansing agent, an external manifestation of the necessary demolition of McCall's internal restraint. In the chaos of the storm, the meticulously constructed barriers between Robert McCall, the retired neighbor, and Robert McCall, the operative, dissolve entirely. The film uses this elemental fury to excuse the scale of the ensuing violence, allowing McCall to operate not just as a man seeking vengeance, but as a force of natural correction asserting dominance over human corruption. The darkness and the deluge obscure his identity, ironically granting him a freedom of action he cannot possess under clear skies, where every move is subject to the scrutiny he desperately tries to avoid. This final sequence emphasizes the idea that for a man like McCall, redemption is not found in quiet withdrawal, but in decisive, overwhelming action that eradicates the source of the moral injury. His surgical dismantling of the remaining threats amidst the wind and rain is a masterclass in situational awareness, proving that his skills are not fading with age, but are instead becoming more finely tuned by the urgency of his mission. He weaponizes the environment with an instinctual understanding, turning downed power lines and flooded corridors into tools of strategic elimination. The physicality Washington brings to these moments, the grimace of exertion barely visible under the sheets of water, shows the immense toll this final duty exacts, a toll he accepts as penance. What elevates this conclusion beyond simple action fare is the underlying emotional current tied to Susan. Every life McCall takes in this climax is, in a twisted sense, a tribute to the woman who tried to save him from himself. By systematically eliminating the network that deemed her a liability, he is retroactively protecting her memory and validating the belief she held in his essential goodness. It is a highly personalized form of warfare waged against bureaucratic indifference and institutional cowardice. The silence that follows the storm's passing is not one of peace, but of profound emptiness. The immediate threat is neutralized, but the machinery of conflict that created him still exists, waiting for the next emergency that will inevitably drag the Equalizer back from the quietude he briefly earned. His departure into the receding rain confirms his status as a necessary anomaly, forever barred from the normal rhythm of the community he strives to safeguard. The film's dedication to showcasing McCall's internal war manifests most acutely in his relationship with time. He lives his civilian life strictly regimented: wake up, observe, serve, rest, as if adhering to a rigid schedule can somehow contain the inherent volatility of his past. This discipline is a shield against introspection. When he is driving for the ride-share service, the brief, impersonal interactions allow him to remain an observer, a shadow absorbing data without forming deep, vulnerable attachments, save for the few he has carefully vetted, like Mrs. Rodriguez and Miles. The murder of Susan Plummer rips a gaping hole in this fragile structure because she represented the only person who understood the inherent necessity of his past actions and the hope for his peaceful present. Her death was not just a loss of friendship, it was a targeted attack on the possibility of McCall's retirement. The antagonists, those former colleagues turned mercenaries, are depicted with a cold, almost robotic efficiency that serves to further highlight McCall's burdened humanity. They execute orders without the agonizing self-doubt that plagues McCall. They are products of the system's inherent amorality, whereas McCall wrestles constantly with the distinction between righteous correction and mere killing. This divergence is critical. McCall's fight is as much against the ideology that produced his enemies as it is against the men themselves. He is attempting to prove that a person forged in the crucible of covert warfare can still choose a higher, albeit violent, form of ethical accountability. Miles Whittaker functions as the fragile embodiment of McCall's second chance, the potential for a life lived through creation rather than necessary destruction. McCall's guidance to Miles is delivered with the same intensity he uses in tactical planning. Every word is weighed, every warning precise. This mentorship is McCall's subconscious effort to externalize the good he fears he has suffocated within himself. When McCall forces Miles to confront danger during the setup for the final confrontation, it is a cruel, necessary lesson. Survival requires seeing the world as it truly is, dangerous and unforgiving, before one can attempt to build beauty upon its foundations. The contrast between the vibrant energy of Miles's burgeoning artistic talent and the grim practical necessity of McCall's preparations forms the emotional core of the film's search for meaning outside of violence. The lingering silence after the hurricane, when the immediate threat has been excised, is perhaps the most telling scene in terms of McCall's enduring psychological state. It is a quiet heavier than the storm itself, devoid of the clarifying energy of action. Washington portrays this aftermath with a profound stillness, suggesting that the temporary restoration of order has done little to quiet the relentless internal auditor that resides within him. He retreats not to celebrate, but to assess the damage to his own fragile equilibrium. The act of returning to his modest apartment, perhaps wiping the grime from a photograph of Susan, is a ritual of inventory, counting the cost of adherence to his self-appointed duty. His interactions with the community remain deliberately circumscribed, maintained by an almost performative kindness. He ensures the bookshop operates smoothly, that his elderly neighbors are safe, but these connections are fundamentally asymmetric. They receive his protection. He offers them only a curated version of himself, sanitized of the necessary bloodshed required to maintain their safety. This insulation prevents true intimacy, confirming that the man capable of such precise, devastating violence cannot safely occupy the space of the average citizen. His skill set demands isolation. The film uses the conspiracy itself, the shadowy intelligence apparatus, to symbolize the impossibility of true retirement for men with McCall's unique skill set. They are not simply seeking to silence loose ends. They are reaffirming the principle that assets belong to the system, even in retirement. Susan's murder was a demonstration of ownership. McCall's subsequent rampage is therefore not just revenge, but a ferocious, unilateral declaration of independence from the state apparatus that both created and discarded him. He fights not to rejoin their world, but to prove that he can dismantle their influence from the outside, on his own terms. The mentorship of Miles continues to serve as the film's most potent symbol of hope, yet it is inherently tinged with fatalism. McCall is essentially teaching Miles how to survive in a world that McCall himself cannot fully inhabit peacefully. He is passing on the necessary survival skills, the ability to observe, to react, but crucially, he is also modeling the choice to redirect that formidable focus toward creation. It is the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, using his grim expertise to ensure someone else can pursue a life untainted by that same expertise. The unspoken tragedy is that McCall knows, intrinsically, that he can never fully embrace the path he clears for the younger man. His own history has rendered him a permanent specialist in necessary evil. The film concludes not with resolution, but with continuance. McCall remains the sentinel, listening for the next crack in the facade of peace that only he is equipped to mend. The emotional calculus underpinning McCall's every move is rooted in a deep-seated, almost crippling sense of earned guilt. Denzel Washington portrays this not through histrionics, but through a profound physical economy, a reluctance to waste movement, suggesting that every unnecessary gesture is a luxury his burdened soul cannot afford. His commitment to the mundane tasks, stocking shelves, driving routes, is an active form of penance, an attempt to balance the scales of his past by accumulating small, verifiable acts of positive contribution. This self-imposed structure highlights the internal violence he constantly suppresses. The greatest battle he fights is against the professional instinct to categorize, analyze, and eliminate every minor inconvenience in his path. Susan Plummer represented the final fragile thread connecting McCall to the possibility of a normal, redeemed existence. Her death, orchestrated with the cold, bureaucratic precision common to high-level assassinations, signifies the system's ultimate victory over individual conscience. When McCall begins his investigation, it is less about tracking killers and more about auditing his own moral failure to protect the one person who understood the true depth of his capacity for violence. He is confronting the architects of his former life, men who value operational security over human life, forcing him to weaponize the very skills he sought to bury. The film meticulously contrasts McCall's world with that of the mercenaries he hunts. These enemies are devoid of internal conflict. They are the system's cleanup crew, efficient, untroubled by the existential weight of their actions. Their reliance on technology and networked coordination is pitted against McCall's reliance on intimate environmental knowledge and pure physical expertise, the analog ghost against the digital network. This confrontation is framed as a battle between transactional violence and duty-bound retribution. McCall fights not for a paycheck or a clean record, but for the memory of an ethical relationship, a motivation the corporate assassins simply cannot comprehend, rendering them tactically predictable to the superior, morally driven operative. Miles's role as the apprentice remains crucial, acting as a barometer for McCall's own lingering hope. The lessons imparted are often harsh, designed to strip away naivete, but the underlying message is one of preservation. McCall invests his grim wisdom into Miles so that the next generation does not have to resort to becoming the Equalizer. It is a transfer of necessary knowledge for survival in a corrupt world, coupled with an urgent plea to choose creation over destruction. Washington imbues these mentoring moments with a paternal gravity, suggesting that securing a worthwhile future for Miles is the only meaningful legacy a man like Robert McCall can hope to leave behind, a legacy built on the potential for a life lived fully, something permanently denied to the operative himself. The pervasive sense of urban alienation that McCall navigates daily is essential to understanding his character's isolation. He moves through the densely populated streets of his neighborhood as an island of hyper-competence amidst a sea of routine human frailty. His meticulous attention to the details of his surroundings, the timing of traffic lights, the pattern of shadows cast by street lamps, the subtle shift in a pedestrian's gait, is not paranoia but professional reflex, the operating system of a man designed for perpetual threat detection. This constant processing drains him, evidenced by the moments he allows himself a brief, almost imperceptible slump when waiting at a crosswalk, a flicker of exhaustion that vanishes the moment a potential threat is registered. The film cleverly uses sound design to externalize McCall's internal state. In moments of peace, the sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the chatter from the bodega, the rumble of the subway, are muted, almost indistinct, filtered through the soundproofing of his self-imposed emotional distance. However, when action is imminent, the soundscape snaps into hyper-clarity, the distinct click of a poorly maintained door latch, the specific caliber of an approaching vehicle, the ragged breath of a nervous adversary. This auditory focus is Denzel Washington's masterful interpretation of McCall's trauma, a heightened sense of awareness that ensures he is never truly surprised, but is forever unable to simply enjoy the ambient noise of normal life. The professional network that Susan represented was McCall's tenuous bridge back to legitimacy. Her removal wasn't just eliminating a sympathetic ear, it was cutting the lifeline to the only institutional figure who could potentially vouch for his good behavior. The ensuing hunt is therefore a war waged against the very concept of bureaucratic surveillance. When McCall confronts the organization's agents, the choreography reflects this philosophical struggle. He doesn't just defeat them physically, he systematically dismantles their operational superiority, using their over-reliance on technology and pre-planned infiltration routes against them. He turns their predictable doctrine, the established rules of engagement for X assets, into their fatal weakness. Miles Whitaker remains the living embodiment of the moral high ground McCall strives to defend, yet can never fully occupy. The artistic process Miles undertakes, the painstaking layering of color, the deliberate composition of an image, is the antithesis of McCall's necessity for immediate, brutal erasure. McCall's investment in Miles is a desperate attempt to cultivate something pure that his own existence has poisoned. He is teaching Miles self-defense, not so Miles can become an equalizer, but so he can remain unmolested while pursuing a life defined by contribution. The weight Washington carries in these scenes suggests a man acutely aware that he is merely a dark foundation upon which fragile beauty is being constructed, a foundation that could be exposed and destroyed at any moment by the very forces he momentarily held at bay. The quiet resolution, therefore, is never truly satisfying, as it only confirms McCall's continued lonely vigil on the fringes. The very aesthetic of McCall's actions during the climax embodies a form of necessary vandalism against the polished veneer of institutional evil. When he breaches high-security locations, it is rarely through subtle electronic infiltration, the preferred method of the organization that hunted Susan, but through overwhelming, direct physical force guided by perfect geometry. He doesn't pick a lock, he forces the structure around the lock to yield. This reflects his disillusionment. Subtlety and bureaucracy failed Susan. Only brutal, undeniable action can rectify that failure. Washington's portrayal of these moments eschews the slickness of other action heroes. There is strain in his movements, a visible pushback against the immense force he channels, confirming that this power is a burden, not a gift. His moments of solitary reflection, often standing by the water, watching the ebb and flow of the tides, are fraught with unspoken dialogue with Susan. These scenes suggest that his entire crusade is a continuous, drawn-out conversation with her memory. He doesn't speak aloud, but the unwavering focus in his gaze, the subtle hardening of his jawline, imply promises being renewed. I will clean this up, for you. This internal dialogue justifies the extreme measures he takes, elevating the conflict from a simple manhunt to a sacred obligation, a penance paid in the currency of his enemies' lives. The theme of professional obsolescence hangs heavy over McCall, particularly when dealing with the younger, technologically adept mercenaries. They view him as a relic, a man whose tradecraft belongs to a less connected era. Yet McCall consistently proves that foundational understanding of human psychology and environmental exploitation trumps networked sophistication. He anticipates their reliance on screens and comms, using the storm's electromagnetic interference as a deliberate amplifier for their confusion. This intellectual victory over the modern shadow operatives underscores McCall's enduring relevance. He is a master of principles, while they are merely masters of protocols. Miles Whitaker's artistic evolution serves as a continuous gentle critique of McCall's chosen path. As Miles perfects a challenging technique, achieving perspective and depth on canvas, McCall is simultaneously deepening his own mastery of creating irreversible finality. The irony is poignant. The student learns to create lasting beauty, while the teacher achieves only temporary, destructive silence. When McCall finally ensures Miles's immediate safety, it is not a paternal act of pride, but a transference of burden. He is safeguarding the one piece of clean creation he can influence. The film implies that McCall's true, final mission is not to defeat the organization, but to ensure that the next generation possesses the tools to recognize and resist its corruption before it demands their souls, a fight McCall knows he can only wage from the outside, perpetually stained by the necessary darkness. The persistent, almost tactile sense of anonymity that McCall cultivates is the final layer of his self-protection, a necessary camouflage that allows him to operate outside the defined parameters of society. He chooses roles, like the rideshare driver or the bookstore stalker, that mandate proximity without requiring true connection. These jobs are deliberately low stakes, allowing him to blend into the background noise of urban existence. When he interacts with customers, his responses are economical, bordering on monosyllabic, calibrated to satisfy the social contract without inviting deeper scrutiny. Washington plays this guarded nature beautifully. His eyes often seem focused on a point just past the person he is addressing, perpetually scanning the periphery for the first sign of intrusion. The film subtly introduces the idea that McCall's operational effectiveness is directly proportional to his emotional starvation. The brief, unguarded moments of connection, a shared joke with a bakery owner about the weather, a moment of shared quiet appreciation for a piece of music overheard, are not moments of comfort, but rather small, controlled system leaks. He allows them only long enough to confirm that the world he fights for is worth the isolation he endures, before ruthlessly sealing the breach. This internal regulation keeps him lethal, but profoundly lonely. The confrontation with the organization's leadership is framed less as a strategic battle and more as a spiritual reckoning. The executives and handlers he faces are sheltered within layers of security and plausible deniability, embodying the institutional sickness that metastasized beyond control. McCall's assault on their headquarters is an act of surgical exorcism, targeting the specific nodes of moral compromise. His efficient dismantling of their security detail is a pointed message. The protocols designed to contain rogue assets are meaningless against someone who has nothing left to protect but his own redefined code of honor. He systematically invalidates their authority by proving that the system they worship is inherently fragile when confronted by genuine, uncompromising principle. Miles, in his determined pursuit of artistic mastery, unintentionally becomes McCall's confessor. The young man's dedication to capturing fleeting moments of beauty, a shaft of sunlight, the texture of old brick, forces McCall to confront the permanence of the ugliness he perpetrates. McCall's protection of Miles is an attempt to offset the cosmic balance sheet. For every life he extinguishes in the storm's wake, he ensures one dedicated to creation survives. This dynamic establishes the film's ultimate, ambiguous conclusion. McCall will never find peace, but he can ensure that others might find a different way to live in the world he has temporarily cleaned. He remains the necessary ghost, his only solace found in the sound of a hammer striking metal in Miles's workshop, signaling construction rather than destruction. Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel The Territory of Cinema. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the film The Equalizer 2 from 2018. The quiet life Robert McCall had carved out for himself in Brooklyn, a sanctuary built on the foundation of his past, begins to fracture with the news of a familiar loss. Susan Plummer, a dear friend and former colleague from his days working covertly for the CIA, is found dead. The official report cites a robbery gone wrong, but the unnerving precision of the scene whispers a different truth to McCall. He recognizes the hallmarks of a professional cleanup, a message sent through the violence aimed squarely at those who knew too much about the agency's darker operations. McCall, a man whose retirement was less about rest and more about channeling his extraordinary, almost lethal skill set into small acts of localized justice, helping the oppressed in his neighborhood, tutoring at a local community center, cannot let Susan's death be dismissed. His commitment to fairness, honed over years as a Black Ops operative whose official records were scrubbed clean, compels him to investigate. This isn't the random street violence he usually counters. This targets his history. His investigation pulls him back into the shadows he swore he'd left behind. The trail leads him toward a network of former operatives, men and women similarly disbanded or sidelined after key missions. He starts by examining Susan's last known contacts, eventually focusing on a specific, highly compartmentalized assignment they both worked on years prior in Istanbul, something involving international intrigue and perhaps significant misappropriation of resources or classified information. This quest for vengeance, or perhaps more accurately for truth and retribution, places him directly opposite his former employers and handlers. Dave York, another veteran from their shared past, emerges as a key figure. York, disillusioned and bitter, has channeled his exceptional tactical abilities into a mercenary operation, essentially privatizing the CIA's dirty work for the highest bidder. He has become the very thing they once fought against, an agent operating without conscience or oversight, now directly involved in Susan's murder to tie up loose ends concerning the old mission. The narrative becomes a slow, methodical tightening of the net. McCall uses his meticulous preparation, the careful surveillance, the acquisition of necessary tools often purchased from his network of aging, loyal contacts, like the reliable pharmacist in his neighborhood, to dismantle York's operation piece by piece. We see echoes of his past proficiency, the sudden, brutal efficiency in confined spaces, the strategic use of everyday objects as weapons, the almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. The climax finds McCall tracking the remaining members of York's crew to a small, remote coastal town that serves as their fortified base of operations. It's here, against the backdrop of a fierce storm, a fitting atmospheric mirror to the violence about to unfold, that McCall confronts his old comrade, York. The ensuing fight is intensely personal, a clash between two men who understand the language of lethal force better than any other. McCall is fighting not just for Susan, but for the very integrity of the moral code he tries to uphold in his quiet life. He systematically eliminates the threat, restoring a semblance of balance to the chaos York introduced. The final confrontation with York is a definitive, somber end to the old chapter, confirming that while the ghosts of the past can be put down, they never truly vanish. McCall then retreats once more to the anonymity of his present, the silent guardian having completed his necessary, albeit brutal, work. The weight of Susan's death felt heavier than any assignment McCall had ever undertaken. It was a personal violation, not just of his peace, but of the fragile trust he had placed in the idea that stepping away meant safety. He carried the sorrow of their shared history, a bond forged in the ethically gray expanse of espionage, where loyalty was currency and failure meant oblivion. Susan had always been the compass in the dark for him, the one who understood the inherent contradiction in being a killer trained to protect. His day-to-day life, filled with the quiet rhythm of driving elderly neighbors to appointments and working diligently at the community center, now felt like a thinly stretched veneer over a roaring engine of capability. When he walked those streets, the people he helped, the kids learning from him, the old folks relying on his steadfast presence, were his new purpose, the tangible evidence that his skills could be directed toward creation rather than destruction. But Susan's murder demanded the latter. As McCall delved deeper, the names he uncovered were not strangers, but echoes from his own training syllabus. The realization that York, a man known for his cold competence even in their agency days, had fallen so far as to become a hired gun, confirmed McCall's bleakest assessment of their former world. Once you learn the system will eventually turn you into the enemy. York represented the corrosion of idealism, the transformation of duty into pure, unadulterated profit motive. McCall's methods of investigation were an art form honed by necessity. He didn't use modern digital tracking as much as he relied on human intuition and old-school tradecraft. He visited familiar haunts, a bookshop in the Bronx where information exchanged hands over dusty first editions, a specific diner booth where local whispers converged. He moved through the city like a phantom, observing security patterns, noting shifts in traffic flow, skills that were now automatic, deeply ingrained reflexes that made him terrifyingly effective against men who relied on predictable, modern surveillance. When he finally located York's operation, hidden away from the glittering scrutiny of the city, the isolation only amplified the danger. McCall felt a deep, almost paternal disappointment in York, a sense that this descent could have been avoided if only the agency had treated its veterans better, if only they hadn't left capable men adrift. This wasn't simply about payback. It was about correcting a fundamental imbalance caused by the men who pulled the strings and then abandoned the instruments. The final confrontation was less a battle and more a necessary exorcism. The storm outside mirrored the internal maelstrom McCall had kept bottled up for years. In facing York, McCall wasn't just fighting a former colleague. He was fighting the person he might have become had he not found Susan and the quiet anchors of his later life. Each move was deliberate, precise, stripped of ego or wasted energy. It was the quiet equalizer demonstrating why he was still the master of his domain, because while others embraced the chaos for profit, McCall only embraced it to restore order, however violent that restoration might be. When the dust settled and the last breath left York, McCall felt only the familiar, grim satisfaction of a job done correctly, a debt paid in full, allowing him to return once more to the quiet pursuit of being just Robert. The air of finality that settled over the coastal aftermath was thick, yet strangely purifying for McCall. He stood for a moment, the relentless wind whipping at his coat, taking in the wreckage not with pride, but with the tired resignation of a craftsman surveying a necessary demolition. He was a specialist in necessary endings, and this one, the extinguishing of Dave York, felt particularly heavy because it involved extinguishing a piece of his own past. McCall's true motivation was rooted deeply in his foundational belief that even the most damaged individuals deserve to be seen, to have their stories acknowledged, something the agency actively tried to prevent. Susan was owed that acknowledgement. She had been a lifeline, a reminder that morality could exist even within the machinery of covert warfare. Her death was the final, definitive failure of the system they had both served, a system that consumed its best agents and discarded the evidence of their service. Reflecting on his own career, the narrative of McCall was one of perpetual reinvention. He was the ghost of multiple operative identities, each one defined by unparalleled efficiency in gathering intelligence or executing extraction. His inspiration wasn't grand ideology, it was the cold logic of protecting the innocent, a code he translated into the present by ensuring the local bakery owner didn't pay protection money, or that a young artist wasn't intimidated off his livelihood. These small victories were the antidote to the massive, often morally compromised victories of his former life. The confrontation with York had been visceral because York understood the language of commitment. York hadn't just betrayed the mission, he had betrayed the self-discipline required to leave the mission behind. McCall noticed the small details in York's heavily armed bunker. The same brand of tactical gear they favored in Beirut years ago, a grim sign that York had never truly moved on, only upgraded his employer. When the final blow was struck, it wasn't a surge of anger that propelled McCall, but a quiet, almost mournful recognition of inevitability. He saw in York the path of unchecked bitterness. McCall's own solace in his solitary apartment, the precise placement of his few belongings, and the quiet respect he commanded from his neighbors were evidence of a constant, conscious struggle to choose structure over chaos. Leaving the scene under the shroud of the retreating storm, McCall allowed himself one brief indulgence, a mental note to visit Susan's grave, not to mourn publicly, but to report his success in securing the truth, a final status update to the only person who might truly understand the cost. He was already fading back into the urban fabric, the man who existed between appointments, the shadow who ensured that for some,